Thanks very much for the intro. Welcome to the panel. I want you to all do me a favour after this and take out your iPhones if you have an iPhone, go into your password settings and just have a look at whether Apple has identified the number of passwords that have been compromised in previous breaches. I do this test a lot of time with our clients, and usually at least half the room is using passwords that have already been identified in a breach, and it's sitting right there in your iPhone. Right, we're going to get straight into it. We're going to start, Nicola, with a question for you. The video before the break, Asaf said that every financial institution should be aware that they are on a target list, and that we should be assuming that breaches are likely to happen. How does, in an environment where the threat actors are constantly evolving their methods of attack, how does CBA keep one step ahead? And once you've answered that, give us some insight into how different financial institutions that perhaps don't have CBA's resources and capabilities, what they can be doing to stay one step ahead.
Yeah, John, happy to talk about that. Firstly, thank you for having me here. It's an important conversation, and it's great to see cyber resilience kind of on this sort of level of agenda. If I think about Combank, like, you know, our customers are 24/7, 365 days a year, expect safe and secure banking, right? That's just core part of what we do and a key priority for us. So to your point about how do we stay ahead, you know, it is an ever-evolving space. And maybe if I zoom out for a second, if you think, you know, cyber as a profession is still relatively new. And if you go back to something like the 1980s and 90s, our goal was identifying our technology assets and working out how we were going to protect them. And you fast forward to 2024, and our thinking has evolved, right? The landscape is evolving, but our thinking has shifted where we build on that and we look at how do we make sure we're really detecting threat actors in our environment, how do we think about response and recovery, and that really kind of lands us in this theme of resilience for today. If I give you two examples of some of the things that we do to stay ahead, the first is really understanding the threats against the business. Like, that's just critical. You know, we seek to understand the motivations of threat actors. We look at real world events. So every real world incident that you see, we look at it and we say, what happened there? What do we know about things that went wrong and controls that failed, or you know, issues that a business has experienced? And then how do we think about adapting our defences? And we do a lot of this in real time. We have real-time intelligence information that we look at in our organisation, and then we adapt our defences accordingly. So I think that sort of looking at the threats, understanding what the threat actors look like and how they were attacking your organisation, but doing that in a really intelligence-led, data-driven way is critical. And maybe the second thing I'll comment on, because Asaf mentioned it a little bit in the video, but is the other end of that spectrum of crisis preparedness. We exercise what it looks like to be attacked. Practice, 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 right? We look at, and we do it through the lens with a focus of how do we minimize impact to customers? And we do it in a way where it's the whole organisation that is involved. So we think about not just the cyber team doing some of that crisis exercising, but our product teams, our communications teams, our legal teams are all at the table. So looking at how we would respond in that sort of situation. And then we take that further and we go out to those across our sector and across other sectors, and we exercise, you know, we really strongly advocate for this across sector exercising. And I guess that leads to just the last part of the question, I think. So what do others do that maybe don't have the same level of capability? So firstly, I think you should have a level of capability that is commensurate with the risk to your business. And then secondly, you know, participating in a lot of our community activities, because cyber is an area where Team Australia is the focus. And we invest heavily as a community in sharing of information. That's everything from intelligence to sharing on that crisis exercising. You know, I've had our regulators, we've had industry partners, we've had other sectors come and observe our exercising at CommBank, and we do the same so we can learn from others. So I think just that participating, is in the community to pick up on those lessons learned is important.
How anxiety provoking is it to have a regulator come and watch your simulation?
It's different, right? And it's really helpful. I think we're all in it together, right? We're all we all have the same goal and the same outcomes. Yep. So the more we can learn from each other, and actually the regulators appreciating what it looks like when you go through that sort of exercise, is actually really helpful.
Thanks. Alastair, can we go to you and pick up on Nicola's point around understanding threat actors? We've got criminal threat actors who we should assume perhaps that they're financially motivated. We've got political threat actors who might have, or geopolitical threat actors who might have different motivations. Just how do we need to think differently about different threat actors, and then should we be taking different steps to protect us from state-based versus criminal groups?
Yeah, thanks, John. I agree completely with what Nicola said about understanding who it is that may want to cause you harm. If I understand the motive, and if I understand the group with that motive, then I can understand their methodologies, and therefore if I'll often say to clients, if you've only got $1 to spend, you can't smear it across everything. You have to put it somewhere. You have to make a risk decision. None of us have endless cash, and as a consequence you have to devote your effort to places and to things. Protecting those critical assets and functions or outputs of those critical assets is most important. Understanding that a criminal group will behave in a totally different manner, will use different methodologies to attack you, lets you spend that dollar more wisely. So criminals by their nature, and I've sadly spent most of my life dealing with them, they're predictable creatures. Even when they're subtle in the types of crimes that we see, they have a very different signature to that of a nation state. They don't have the dwell time. They have no interest in the dwell time. They want to achieve whatever their objective is. And while there's always an edge case, there's always some group somewhere that proves it wrong. The vast bulk are eminently predictable. If you understand, therefore, and you can track the groups, a group that's active in North America attacking banks is likely to also attack banks here because they're agnostic as to who their victim is. They look for either technologies that they will abuse, or they understand better how a certain sector works, so they'll victimise that sector. There are some that specialise in oil and gas that will have no interest whatsoever. And that's not just because they've got a weird fetish for oil and gas. They just take the path of least resistance every time they do this type of crime. They have no malice towards you. They've just got a malice towards society. Nation states are fundamentally different, right? You cannot stop them. That we know for sure. If you're on the list, on the collect list from a nation state, eventually they'll achieve their objective. The only question is how much effort they have to go to get there. And so the risk equation is fundamentally different. You want to detect it as quickly as possible versus maybe prevent a lot of, to Adam's point, 99% of the white noise. Maybe you can stop with certain things. And others you need much more specialised monitoring to better see, perhaps, if you ever can, that a nation-state offender is there. But for the vast bulk of this audience, it's criminals that are the problem. And again, we can admire the intelligence problem, but intelligence agencies, as harmful as they can be and not have our best interests at heart, they don't cause the same type of harm. I'll finish on this, John, and say that criminals monetise harm. That's just what they do. Nation states, I'm going to say generally don't, with an asterisk, knowing of course now that there's some evidence that China is looking to cause harm with some of its malware, and Russia has shown a flagrant disregard for the consequences of their actions. But it's not their main objective. Yep. The main objective for a criminal is to cause harm and monetise it.
And if we look then at what that criminal group might be doing and evolving their kind of methodologies and their capabilities, we've had a lot of conversations over the last day and a half about AI. We read a lot about AI and cyber. Give us a flavour, Alastair, of perhaps what criminals might be thinking, how they're thinking about AI, but then how we as organisations should be thinking about the intersection of AI and cyber.
Yep. I'm going to sound like a bit of an AI skeptic here, so I apologise for everyone. Now, Adam and I were talking prior to him coming back on stage, and he mentioned an AI example, by the way, an amazing edge case of deep fake. AI will impact us most with deep fakes, with the ability to have much more realistic sounding phishing emails or communications with us. Researchers have proven already that you can use AI to generate polymorphic malware that moves around certain pieces of kit. That is a delicious edge case, and if we're focusing our effort on that as organisations, we are failing our organisations. So AI will be used by criminals in just sharpening in my view, sharpening their ability to use large amounts of data and make smart choices from their side to attack us. If you ever go to a cybersecurity conference, which I recommend you do at least once in your life, and I go there way too often, I can tell you that the printing presses that are near those conferences are running out of ink by printing AI inside, sticking it on the side of every box of every single piece of cybersecurity equipment that ever existed. By the way, they're papering over the words blockchain inside, which they all had 3 or 4 years ago, claiming that their device was somehow going to be better because they were using blockchain. So every single appliance that my organisation uses, we're 1,400 cybersecurity engineers and professionals, every one of them says they use AI. And we'll, of course, look at it. But I'm not convinced necessarily, and I'm happy to be corrected by the professionals in the audience, that AI is going to save us from this type of crime or this type of threat actor. And it's going to be down to smart people using the smart technologies that might have a bit of machine learning on the side, and I'm a big fan of machine learning, and it will get smarter and better. It won't kill us and it won't save us, nor will we all be out of our jobs. Nicola. Sorry if I'm a skeptic.
No. I want to ask Nicola though, CBA, how are you using AI? Give us some practical tools of where it might be useful or where you don't think it's useful.
Yeah, look, it's great. And I love that, Alastair, because I think it's also not new, right? Like, AI's been around for a long time. So the hype that's come with Gen AI is quite different and clearly made the whole thing more accessible and therefore put it to the front of a lot of our minds. But look, at CommBank, we think about, probably what I think about it in 3 ways. 1, protecting the AI that we use. Number 2 is protecting against adversarial AI. And the third is using AI power for good, right? But how do we use it to increase and improve our defences? And so if I think about the first one, when we talk about protecting the AI that we use, right? I mean, like most of the audience here, I'm sure we're using AI and machine learning, but also in experimenting with Gen AI as well, looking at how we use that to improve products and services for customers. So in that context, the cyber team is really critical in being able to help the bank make sure that we know how to protect that technology well. So we're a core part of our responsible AI governance. We also partner with others in thinking about that. So, Microsoft is a great example. We have a strategic partnership with them. And when we look at things like ethical hacking and red teaming in cyber, we actually work with them to share learnings on how could you break the models and how could the models be compromised. We look at how we can test our own models in that way. So I think that's one thing. If you look at adversarial AI, I would say, as Alastair said, look, it's some of these edge cases sound really, really extreme. I think in some ways threat actors are using it like a productivity play, a bit like we are, right, to speed up some of the work that they're doing. But when you look at phishing and AI-powered phishing or deepfakes, etc., what we're doing is focusing on how we use some of our advanced machine learning to spot those things. So it's more about fraud and scams when you start to kind of move into that space. So we're looking, we have some really advanced models that take millions of data points and try to identify a fraud and a scam early on. So that's how we think about defending against adversarial AI. And then using the power of AI for good. The number of signals and telemetry that our cyber teams experience these days is just growing exponentially. So using AI in a way where that helps us see through the noise is really important. So we have some great models that we use. We're experimenting with Gen AI in a way that it allows us to see patterns and trends really quickly and forecast like where we might see some problems so that our human analysts and our human cyber analysts can really spend the time on the things that are most important. So there's probably 3 different flavours there, yeah.
Can I say where I think AI is really going to harm us as a community more than from a cybersecurity point of view? It is the deepfake. It's what is truth, and how it will further affect public discourse as it gets peddled through social media channels, and the concept of where I get my facts from significantly changes with that deepfake side. So that's even more of an existential threat to us than it is to our security.
Particularly with the geopolitical overtones.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yep.
Okay, we'll see how that plays out in the US election later this year. Let's switch topic a little bit. When I started in security 20 plus years ago, more years than I care to remember, the role of the chief security officer was predominantly around physical security. It was a kind of in the back office, a lot of chain smoking going on. Chief Security Officer now at CBA, tell us about your role. You've got to influence a very broad spectrum of components of the organisation. And then how do you see your role with the executive and the board?
Yeah, look, it really has changed, I think, and moved and made that shift from being a sort of technical security manager to be much more of a strategic role across the organisation. And if I think about the way we approach security, it is, and actually we were talking about this briefly before we got up here on stage, that the range of roles in security now is just so broad, because we talk about everything from strategic risk to an organisation. We've got technical capability that you have to go really deep on. We've got comms and education, because cyber's everyone's business, right? And the breadth of roles that we have in security, it means that the chief security officer needs to be able to sort of package all of that up together. And if I think about some of my experience of being in front of our leadership teams and being in front of the board, there's a few things I'd call out that might be useful to consider. So one is thinking about contextualising the risk, because it is a business risk we're talking about at the end of the day. And at its core, when you look at cyber, it's about 2 things: disruption to your products and services, or compromise of your data, right? Those are the 2 core issues at play. And when you think about translating the technical challenges of cyber for your exec leadership team or your board, it's about talking about the business risk and being able to do that translation. What does it really mean for customers? What does it really mean for products and services? And someone once said to me, it's a bit like when you go into the boardroom, you might go in talking French and you find the board are talking Spanish, and there's a translation issue. Now, I think it's the cyber team's job to translate, right? We need to walk in the door and be translating what we do into business risk terms, and make that conversation really meaningful. And the second thing I think is you've got to invest in education. So I haven't met a board member, an exec team member that isn't curious and doesn't want to know about the biggest risk facing the business, right? So how do you uplift and level people up? And I think that's a combination of your core cyber team doing that work, and inviting an Alastair and his team, and we do that, right, to talk to our boards and our leadership teams about different perspectives on how to think about cyber. So I think helping others level up in the conversation's key. And maybe the final thing would be to make sure you're always talking about, so what do you need then? So what's the so what and the now what? It's a topic that can be quite full of fear and uncertainty and doubt, right? But you want to go in and talk about the business risk. You want to level up and help everyone kind of get some basic good knowledge of what we're talking about. But then you need to close that out with, so what do you need, right? Most of your leadership teams are going to want to know what support do you need. So how do you really sharply articulate the so what and the now what of the conversation? So I think that's where the CISO or the CSO, the role is really critical in helping lay out some of that conversation at that level.
Alistair, you've worked in government and then in private practice. Have you seen the role kind of evolve, and how do you see it now?
Yep. So the phrase I'd use to Nicola's answer is, we've got to be a dolphin whisperer. Dolphins and humans are allegedly smart but don't understand each other. And I agree, it's actually the responsibility of the technical people to speak in a language that is understood in business. For too long, they've actually benefited by not doing that, and actually by making it their problem, which protected their empires versus actually seeing themselves as part of a business risk discussion. It's dramatically changed. In the 20 or so years, sometimes I've spoken to the same board over 20 years, and which also means I should retire sometime soon, which is fantastic, but the language has changed, right? From a curiosity, is this something that we should actually think about, to we think this is the number one risk we've got or number two risk in the organisation and we don't think we understand it, is really interesting. And then, so the way I've seen it reflected in boards is first, as I say, generationally, first was, is this even something we should worry about? It's a nice curiosity. I want to go home and tell people I learned a bit about crime and spying and it's kind of cool. To where I think a lot of boards are still stuck, which is about compliance. Where are we at on that journey, and why doesn't it ever move? I'm spending money in it. They keep telling me that we've gone up and then we go down. Spoiler alert, it's because they keep changing the way you measure yourself in terms of compliance, right? It's like painting a harbour bridge, it never ends. It's just a constant state of hygiene. And by the way, compliance does not equal security or resilience. It's hygiene, and it's good. Like I wash my hands, it doesn't stop me getting diseases, but it reduces the likelihood, and it means it's one less vector. Hygiene, when it comes to compliance, is a great thing. The more mature boards that I'm speaking to now are saying, and again, I think to Nicola's point, it's the so what bit of cyber. If a cyber tree falls in the woods and no one sees it, who cares, right? It's the so what. And mature boards, I was with one just yesterday in Sydney, say to me, these are the 5 things we care about. The 5 services that we provide, not the systems we're trying to protect, because again, who cares? It's what that system does that matters. What are the 5 things? They could give me a list of 100, but these are the 5 we're focusing on. And then what am I doing and what questions am I asking? Because the board sets strategy, it sets risk tolerance, and it sets governance, right? They're now using those 3 sort of prisms to go back to their technical teams and saying, show me how you're reducing the likelihood of risk being realised on those, for these key outputs, which might have multiple systems. Tell me how you're going to detect it if you can't stop it, because we all know you can't stop everything, and then show me how we're going to respond better to it. That's a much more mature conversation in 2024 than it was in 2002. So I'm a glass half full guy. We're chasing a curve, it's moving away faster than us, but at least we're picking up speed.
Just an unscripted question, but you both talked about the responsibility for that translation sits with technical teams. I think we've probably all been in meetings with executives and boards where they've been presented with something and it's clear that they don't understand 100% of it, but then there are no questions. Are we getting better at asking questions to help that kind of translation?
I mean, I think yes, right? Like, I feel there's still a level of probably sort of people feeling a bit intimidated of not wanting to ask the silly question, but I would encourage, like, put everything on the table, because I think the questions often come from a very different perspective that's really business orientated anyway. And I also think there's much more material that's out there now. If you look at some of the work that the ICD are doing, for example, right, there's much more education, and what I've seen laid out, I think, a little bit more clearly in a few different sources is, what are the more strategic related cyber questions that boards should be asking? So, for example, do I know what my most critical assets are? How well protected are they? To your point, can we recover from an incident? But even, am I spending my money on the right things? Like, what's the return on investment for some of the investment we're making? So I see a level of, questions being asked for sure. But I think that needs to be coupled with ongoing education. So what do you see?
I think, people are asking questions that they traditionally would have been too fearful to ask, which is great. You're not a director of an organisation, certainly one of the ones in this room, if you're not pretty astute, frankly. And everyone starts their career in a space, right? They might have been an accountant or a lawyer or whatever, and they've built up expertise as they've gone higher up in those organisations. They've learnt marketing talk, even though they're not marketers. I'm not a CFO, but I can understand a spreadsheet, and I understand what a margin is. I understand what EBITDA is, and all that type of stuff. I probably didn't say it right because I'm not an accountant. But so everyone has taught themselves and learnt as they claw their way up through organisations all of these other very complex things. And cyber risk is just another one of those. And once they get into it, they realise it's not that hard, because frankly, it's the same risk questions They've been running big IT shops forever, always costing more than we thought, never quite delivering on time. All the same, it's the same things, and you ask the same questions when it comes to matters of cyber and broader risk, because I think to the CSO position, I think it's great to see banks doing this. There is a strong nexus between physical and cyber. Yeah. Right? Anyone that thinks they're separate gets it wrong. Yeah. An intelligence agency, by the way, will use a physical intelligence officer in a location to then breach you electronically, and criminals do the same thing, right? That's why you red team in ways that you red team. So my point is, I think directors are getting better at it, and they've all got the muscle for it, as do CEOs and other C-suite people in these organisations. Smart people running big organisations. This is just one extra little thing to learn. There's no perfection in it because it's risk, which means, yeah, you're going to fail occasionally.
So all the continuum and degrees. Yeah.
Yep.
Nicola, I'm glad you mentioned the AICD, the good work that they're doing, because I spent this Christmas co-authoring the governance guidance on boards, how boards should respond to a cyber incident.
Nice,
so let's
wonderful.
talk. It's a really good piece. I commend it to everyone.
Yeah.
It was
self-assessed.
Self-obsessed, completely self-obsessed.
Self-attestation is
Yeah, absolutely.
questionable.
It was meant to be a short 20-page addendum to their first guidance, and it ended up being a 62-page thesis on all things. But I want to pivot now to incident response. And Alastair, you do an awful lot of it. We've done some together. What can we learn from incidents, and what should we be doing to kind of focus on best practice incident response?
I think there's been a shift in incidents. Again, if you go back 20 years when a cyber matter happened or a technical matter happened, it was often just passed off to the technical people. I now categorise this, and I think it started happening a couple of years ago here when we had those really big matters, which there, for the grace of God, go most organisations, right? Two things now. One is what I call the technical harm, and sometimes I describe it as what's the blast radius of the bomb. You bring in technical teams who will draw a chalk line, as I mix my analogies, draw a chalk line around the body and kind of tell you what's happened. Who did it, maybe, what they did. You can start thinking about the harm, and there's a technical bit. But the second harm that is outsized, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon, is the reputational stakeholder type reaction to events that occur. So what do I mean by that? I mean that how other organisations respond. So if I was a third party that dealt with CommBank and I had an incident, I almost guarantee you CommBank would look to cut connectivity with me, because no one wants contagion. No one can put their hand on heart and say that I'm not a contagion risk when you speak to your board. Therefore, we respond in a way we've never seen before. So we get these now reactions from outside the organisation. I think best practice says that we need to map our stakeholders. Who cares about what matters? And I'm no banker, but I'd be saying a treasurer is going to care. Maybe a PM cares if you're a big enough organisation. A Home Affairs Minister is going to care. We've seen what happens when a Home Affairs Minister doesn't feel like they're adequately briefed, that they don't know what's going on. Again, it's got nothing to do with the actual technical harm. It's a communications matter. It's not understanding who that stakeholder is. An APRA is going to care, obviously. And on it goes. Clearly, your customers and clients are going to care. Your other banks that you're related to are going to care, because if there was a systemic issue. So the reputational stakeholder reactions to an incident, and therefore how you communicate that incident, how you give trust and confidence that you're drawing a chalk line around the body and kind of understand what's happening, is now a bigger outsized harm to an organisation often than the technical matter itself. Which then brings different skills and different sort of obligations to organisations to prepare for these things. And it can be done, again, through that exercising bit, not just technically seeing what happens, but then saying, who's going to care if this thing occurs? Who should we call first? How do we give them confidence? How do we give ourselves confidence? And on it goes. So they've shifted dramatically in the last couple of years. And I describe us as being in a state of anaphylaxis. The smallest matter becomes a big outsized response, which then can often drive harm back into the organisation that even technically wasn't occurring to you.
And what do you see as the role of the media in that? Alastair, do you think have a balanced kind of...
You asked about directors and how they're going and boards. I've spent a long time trying to educate journalists, and even longer probably trying to educate politicians. Boards are much easier to explain these things to than the political class, and definitely to the media. Why? Because of, if the media's here, I apologise. I like you. But so there's the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So I want to know, how big is this? Should they have done better? I used to front the media in government when, invariable cyber risk was realised. And the first question they'd ask me is, could you have done better? And I'd say to them, I wouldn't be standing here explaining this to you if we couldn't have done better. Of course. But now, what's your real questions? Like, how much harm is there? Have you got your arms around it? Are we going to recover? Who did it? Those types of things. So the media just focuses way too much on, sadly, the harm bit. The only benefit, and I'm a glass half full person, as I've said, is that media has actually woken up. I think these reactions, this anaphylaxis, has woken up a lot of other boards and organisations about, God, could this happen to us? Yes. Would we be any better off in handling it? Probably no. So let's get into it. And that's the benefit, I think, of some of the outsized reporting, but it's not been rational. It is not rational. It will not become rational, which therefore highlights my point about the second type of harm, which is how you communicate and give confidence that you have this. It's a friend of mine who used to run Emergency Management Australia said, it's a crisis for a reason, it doesn't go to plan, right? So you can plan all you like. The reality is it will not map to what you've planned, but at least you've exercised the muscle and at least you kind of know how you're going to engage. And that's the biggest harm now we're facing.
Nicola, we've seen many examples in the last few years of where a cyber incident then has a secondary impact, which is around scams, identity theft, financial harm, which is, and the banks have played a really big role in examining that issue and trying to improve information sharing around incidents and individual resilience. How do you kind of see that intersection of someone else's incident and what you do?
What we're doing, yeah. So I think a good way to think about this is to think about the anatomy of a scam. Because you start with information gathering, which might often come from like a data breach, etc. You're gathering information about citizens and businesses. And then you make contact with individuals. You think about social engineering them, right? And gaining their trust. And then you're getting involved in a transaction which leads to a loss of some sort. And when you think about that anatomy of that scam life cycle and you flip it from what the threat actor is doing and look at what we can do as an organisation to protect against that, you find that covers our cyber teams who are doing things like phishing site takedowns, right? They're doing things like, they're preventing the data that you own getting out into the public domain as well and creating that kind of first data set that is useful. You've got your fraud teams who are in the middle of this process and looking at our fraud detection models and helping identify these frauds and scams along the way. You've got financial crime teams who are at play in this ecosystem, looking at how we stop mule accounts being set up in our organisations in the first place. So that connectivity, when you kind of look at the anatomy from the scammer lens and then you look at what's going on in terms of protecting, there's a whole ecosystem of teams across each of our organisations that are critical to and that work together to prevent that activity. And then it goes even broader when you look at the ecosystem as a whole. I mean, one of the things we strongly advocate for is an ecosystem approach to fraud and scams because the telcos play a role, big tech, social media play a role, law enforcement, who are stepping in and driving action as well. So I think that whole of ecosystem view and bringing together cyber and fraud and scams into our collective thinking is really important. I think you can't look at one in isolation.
Okay, great. We've got 6 minutes left. I want to do one final pivot. There's been a lot of conversation around the importance of industry and government cooperation, Team Australia. And that's huge for the financial services sector. Just, Nicola, you first and then you, Alastair. What do you see as the role of industry, of the financial services industry in building a more cyber resilient nation?
Yeah, look, I'll keep this quite simple. Firstly, I think the cyber strategy is just critical. Like, you can't underplay how important it is, I think, to the Australian digital economy. And therefore, industry stepping in alongside government. If I look at what's happening right now, under our current cyber strategy, we actually have an executive cyber council. We have a number of different working groups that are focused on very specific topics where government and industry can partner. So things like, what are sovereign cyber capabilities that we need to keep resources for in Australia? You know, and Alastair and the team at CyberCX are involved in a workforce stream that sits underneath that as well. So I think the financial services industry really stepping in and engaging in those cross-sector, cross-industry government working groups is really important, because we've got the kind of impetus and the focus to get together with a really clear objective, right, and the vision to be you know, bold and one of the most secure countries in the world. That you know, getting involved in that, I think, is really important. Maybe the second point, not smaller, I guess, but just different, would be industry and financial services talking together. I think there's the government relationship, but then there's separately making sure that we are using all of our industry partnerships. You know, we're using our relationships and bilateral conversations as well to help drive change and align to some of the strategic goals as well.
I don't want to sound heretical for the first time in my career. I'm going to give it a shot. If cyber risk was offline, if this was a series of crimes being committed on our streets, premiers would rise and fall, prime ministers would rise and fall on their ability to deal with this. Now, we've got a former premier in the room, but and again, I'm no former premier, but how you do education, how you do health, how you do transport, and how you do law and order are the things that I think state governments rise and fall on. How is it that we have allowed the fastest growing crime, the one that is impacting people in a way that no other crime ever has, and I'm not diminishing the other horrendous crimes that exist offline, but the speed of this and the ability for it to impact against our communities, degrading our trust and confidence in means of communication, in other things that we've previously trusted. How is it that we have somehow allowed governments to step back from this? I used to run the federal government bit, right? So I'm a guilty party in this process. How is it that we have said, what more could banks do to stop this stuff? Not just the scams and things, but a broader cybersecurity issue. Now, if I go back to bank robbery days, banks would do their bit, fly up screens, dive bombs in cash bags and the like, you know, armoured cars in between banks. Great, that's what you would do in the offline world. But you would expect there to be a police service out there that if they drove past a Holden Commodore with 4 people with balaclavas on and shotguns hanging out the window, they wouldn't just drive past and wonder what they are up to, right? They would pull the car up. How is it that we have allowed ourselves to a situation where we keep asking what more private industry should be doing on what is a social public matter? Now, we're the worried well. I run one of the world's biggest professional services firms on cybersecurity. And we've got some of the world's biggest banks in this room. What about the millions of small businesses and the tens of millions of families, none of whom can protect themselves? And we can tell them to patch their operating systems and to have a strong password and use multi-factor, and that's all good advice, that's hygiene. It is not protecting them against this. And in that ecosystem, that I agree with you absolutely, by the way, in the ecosystem model, criminals do not care who they harm. Again, they monetise harm. How is it that we've allowed this? So what more could banks do, as I noticed the flasher timer changing, is banks should lobby government to do more. Okay? You get a lot of stuff pushed onto you, probably quite rightly. But for crime that goes beyond the curtilage of your organisation and dramatically impacts the people that you bank and your families and your society, how have we allowed this to happen over the last 20 years? I set up the first national response to cybercrime in 2002. The government dismantled it 2 years later. Brilliant. Prescient. How is it that they reform that as a joint centre 20 years later and slap themselves on the back? And I love the police. And I care about the political class and the hardship they have of trying to manage a complex economy. But it's a connected economy. It is time for us as citizens to demand government do more, not to provide free services to you. Good luck, do it yourself. But to the rest of the community Absolutely, that should be there, and then you work hand in glove with them. I'm sorry, I have an opinion on it. So
No. Opinion is great. I'm going to take that as your one wish. Our last question was one wish. I'm going to take that as your one wish.
What's your wish,
Nicola, what's your one wish for the one thing you could do to change the resilience of the sector and the nation?
Look, I'm going to focus in on, I think there's many things you could do, but I want to focus in on one thing, which is education, and in two different forms. I think one, probably playing to your point about government, I think we've got to educate citizens, because especially when you look at it through the angle of fraud and scams, like that, the level of, we all intervene way far down the path, right? Rather, when something's gone wrong, how do we help educate our citizens and our businesses across Australia in how to spot and identify some of this activity themselves as well? Because I think upskilling people, but also when I look at it, education, we look at our workforce, right? We just talked about how the cyber teams are growing and have more visibility these days, and the threat landscape is changing. And some of the reports I've seen, in fact, I think it was one from your team, Alastair, like 30,000 jobs of a gap over the next 4 years. There's work to do for us to make sure that we actually bring new skills into this cyber community, because there's a small number of people in this country. To be honest, I could probably name we could name every cyber person in the country at a certain level, right? That there's a small community and there's a big problem to solve. So how do we get ahead of that with education? And I know other banks and certainly Commonwealth, we partner with universities. We're doing a lot of work to try and help step in and do some of that training. I heard from one of the universities recently that the problem they've got is they don't have anyone to train on cyber, because all the professionals are in government or corporate roles defending organisations, right? The people that know how to do it are doing it, and therefore how do you help? How are we getting enough people to step in and train the next generation?
John, you're a terrible moderator because we're over time.
Since we're over time.
Is this over? Let's do this.
I'm gonna.
What about my one wish? Extradition treaty with Russia again. That'd be great.
That's a big wish.
In 2002, they used to cooperate with us. They would help us. Those same teams that now don't. Geopolitics gets in the way, right?
Yeah.
Great.
There you go.
As you hear, we can talk about this all day, but we won't. Please put your hands together for Nicola and Alastair.